What's up, y'all? It's Dr. Paul with Liberty Hill Comics. The channel is where I share my passion and knowledge on comic book collecting, investing, and conservation. I've gotten some requests from viewers about the topics of wet cleaning, deacidification, and resizing. So today, we're going to go more in-depth on these topics than we usually get a chance to do on our conservation videos. We'll talk about these three methods, what they are, when you should use them, and some practical application of how I use them in comic book conservation. Thank you for joining me today for this topic. I appreciate you being here, and if you enjoy this video, please take a few seconds to like, subscribe, and leave me a comment below. When I set out to review the conservation and museum curation literature in search of techniques I could apply to the conservation of comic books, I cast a very broad net and learned as much as I could about paper conservation in general. Not all of what I learned could be applied directly to comic books, because comic books are manufactured using a very specific kind of paper. Technically, two kinds of paper, usually one for the cover and one for the interior wraps. I practiced the techniques I researched every chance I could, and used my knowledge of the literature and my experience, and developed my 9-step method for comic book conservation, which I've shared with you in a previous video that you can view here. In that video, I provided a top-level overview of the rationale and methods for wet cleaning, deacidification, and resizing. Today we're going to go into deeper detail on these procedures, and I'm going to share with you the specific primary literature that I use to develop my methods. I'm also still reading everything I can get my hands on as time permits, so I have some updates to my methods that I plan to implement on an upcoming project that I'll share with you today. But before we get to our main topic, I want to remind everyone that we are closing in on our goal of 1,000 subscribers, and in appreciation of subscribers new and old, I'm giving away this copy of Star Wars #1 in CGC 7.5 with white pages. This is the first appearance of Luke, Leia, Vader, R2, 3PO, and a host of others, as well as the first cover appearance of Obi-Wan and Han Solo. It was published 6 weeks before A New Hope opened in theaters in 1977. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel and follow the link over to that video to comment there for a chance to win. In my 9-step comic book conservation video, I discuss how it's smart to combine as many steps as practical, both to be efficient and because the fewer interventions we do, the better it is for the comic book and the lower the risk of us messing something up. But before we can combine steps, we need to understand each process individually, so let's start with the most basic, wet cleaning. Wet cleaning by its nature is already invasive, so I use the least invasive method that will work to clean the paper. That often means wet cleaning by just water alone. You'll be surprised how effective a quick water bath can be at cleaning old paper, removing tanning, stains, contaminants, and acids. You can use distilled water, and you should if you have city water that is treated with chlorine. If you have well water, especially from lime-filtered aquifers, you will actually get a better long-term result using well water than distilled water because your water is already mildly basic and will deacidify while cleaning and leave an alkaline reserve in the paper to protect against future acid-catalyzed hydrolysis of the cellulose chains, which is the main process through which time degrades and eventually destroys all paper. One step up from room temperature water is warm water, which both cleans better and has more potential to harm paper. The reason why is that when you wash a paper object, paper washes over the surface but also penetrates the fiber matrix and interacts directly with the cellulose molecules. Warm water has more thermal energy than room temperature water and penetrates the paper matrix faster and more completely, therefore has more potential to clean and also more potential to damage paper or the media printed on it than room temp or cold water. Moving up in cleaning power and potential invasiveness, you can add a surfactant to your aqueous bath. You may recall from grammar school chemistry that water is known as the universal solvent, but that's not entirely true. Water is a polar solvent and does not interact well with nonpolar substances like oils and some proteins, like the sizing that is added to paper during manufacturing. That is why paper beads up on the surface of a comic book cover. It is not absorbed immediately, and if you act quickly, you can wipe it off as if it were never there. Unsized paper does not behave that way. It absorbs or imbibes water readily and soaks it up immediately upon contact like a sponge. Practical examples of unsized paper include filter paper or paper towels. During wet cleaning, we need the solute to penetrate the paper, and comic book covers, being sized paper, are mildly hydrophobic and therefore resist wetting and resist aqueous cleaning. Surfactants are molecules that have one end that interacts with the water and one end that interacts with the nonpolar substances and therefore act as a go-between the water and hydrophobic substances. They do two things for us during washing. They allow sized paper to readily imbibe our aqueous solution, and they lift any hydrophobic contaminants in the paper into solution and allow them to be washed away. Conservationists use surfactants sparingly and usually as a last resort. You can use mixtures of water and alcohols to lower the surface tension of the water as well. When I need it, my go-to surfactant is Triton X100. It's essentially inert with respect to our paper matrix, and it doesn't have any colorants or perfumes or antibiotics like commercial liquid soaps or dish soap. We don't know how these contaminants will interact with our paper long term, so we don't want to introduce them to the paper of comic books we're trying to preserve for 100 years or more. The point at which a surfactant has maximized the wetting ability of water is called the critical micelle concentration, or CMC. This is the concentration when cleaning action is maximized relative to the amount of surfactant. We always want to take a conservative approach to conservation, so we want to use the lowest concentration of surfactant that is effective. Triton X100 has a CMC of 0.22 to 0.24 millimolar and is sold at concentrations of 1.7 molar. I've performed the calculations so you don't have to, and I've worked out a nice rule of thumb for using Triton X100 for paper conservation. To get a solution at approximately the CMC, I use a syringe with an 18 gauge needle and I dispense 1 drop of Triton X100 per 100 mils of washing solution I'm making up. That's all you need to get maximum cleaning power. For practical purposes, I often use 5 drops of Triton X100 in 500 mils of water or water calcium hydroxide solution. Triton X100 readily goes into solution in water and many other solvents, so nothing special is required to make the solution other than a little bit of gentle stirring to make sure you have a uniform distribution of the surfactant. Drop size does vary by orifice, so if you use a syringe with a needle other than an 18 gauge, you will want to do your own calculations. Regarding deacidification, many methods have been tested, but the original work of Margaret Hay is in many ways still the standard. She first published her method in 1979 based on conservation techniques that had already been in use for centuries, and provided an in-depth review and refined methods in 1987. A solution of anywhere from 10 to 100% saturated calcium hydroxide is used for up to 3 washes of 30 minutes each, but as little as 5 minutes can be effective. The easy way to make this solution is to put your calcium hydroxide powder in a container and add water. Seal the container and shake vigorously, then let settle. This solution in the old days before the development of modern chemistry was called milk of lime. It settles, as this time-lapse video shows, to a milky solid on the bottom and a more or less clear solution above of saturated calcium hydroxide. The clear solution is 100% saturated, and you can just do simple dilution of that layer for your deacidification bath. When you need more calcium hydroxide solution, you just add more water, shake, and let the solution settle again. You do need to keep your saturated calcium hydroxide sealed, because it will react with CO2 and air to form calcium carbonate over time, which isn't harmful to your comics, but will decrease the potency of your calcium hydroxide solution. You can deacidify comic books in this solution directly, but I usually use it at concentrations between 50 and 20% saturated in several washes. So for practical purposes, that means using between 100 and 250 mils per 500 ml wash, the balance being water with which it mixes readily, so no special steps need to be taken to prepare your solution. We mentioned sizing briefly when we discussed the surfactants and the need for the water to interact with the paper during washing. As I mentioned, sizing is something that is added to the cellulose matrix to give the paper better properties. It penetrates and coats the paper fiber matrix, protecting it, and it makes it less permeable, which greatly improves the ability of the paper to take ink on its surface rather than have the ink drawn down into the paper. It also makes the surface of the paper smoother, gives it protection from penetration of contaminants, makes it less prone to creasing, and increases the mechanical strength. The covers of comic books are sized, and over time the sizing can degrade and be lost, especially with comic books that have been exposed to a lot of moisture at some point in their past. When we wash the cover, the solutions we use interact with the sizing and inevitably remove some of it. If we remove too much sizing, the resultant paper will not match the quality of the original paper. It will not have the same surface impermeability to water, and it will not be as strong. It will be more susceptible to creasing and water incursion, both liquid and gaseous, and therefore more prone to damage from water in the future. In practice, you will know when this happens because your paper will be limp after wet cleaning or deacidification baths. As conservators, we do not want to leave the paper weak and susceptible to future damage, to say nothing of how it no longer matches the original properties of the comic book cover, which certainly is noticeable to both your fellow collectors and third-party grading companies like CGC. So, we need to add sizing back to our comic book covers when we complete wet cleaning or deacidification steps that affect the sizing of the paper. Sometimes the removal of original sizing is minimal and it's not necessary to resize. But if you're doing excessive washing or deacidification steps, I resize the cover as my last step prior to paper tear seals. I use methyl cellulose to resize. I make a 1% solution, and my last wash, if I'm resizing, is usually 400 mils of my 1% methyl cellulose solution and 100 mils of my saturated calcium hydroxide solution. This gives comic book covers a nice original feel in terms of stiffness and paper strength, and leaves the alkaline reserve in the paper to protect against future acid-catalyzed hydrolysis of the cellulose matrix. In practice, methyl cellulose is quite difficult to get into solution. You can't just dump a tablespoon of methyl cellulose in water. It won't go into solution. It will just clump and float around. And if it's not in solution, it's not doing anything to resize your paper. Here's the most effective method I've found to get the 1% solution. I take 100 to 125 mils of water and heat it to 80 to 90 degrees centigrade. Once it's almost at that temperature, I add my methyl cellulose. One tad, yes, a tad is an actual measurement equal to 1/4 of a teaspoon. 1 tad in 400 mils of water is approximately 1% methyl cellulose by weight. If you just dump it into the solvent, however, it will clump irreversibly and never go into solution. So, I take a piece of cardstock and spread the methyl cellulose powder onto the cardstock. Then, I sprinkle a little bit of a time into my solution. occasionally stirring to ensure I have no clumps. When you have added all of the powder, you will have a cloudy suspension but no lumps. To this, you add the rest of the water to bring the total up to 400 ml and place the solution in the refrigerator overnight. The next day, the solution will be 100% clear and you will have an excellent resizing bath. In practice, you may use it like any other aqueous wash, but be careful. The paper matrix is especially weak when bathed in methyl cellulose, so keep that in mind and keep manipulations to an absolute minimum. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive video on wet cleaning, deacidification, and resizing for comic books. In our next video, we're going to be putting some of these techniques to work. Most of the materials I mentioned in the video today are available from Amazon in the affiliate links in the description if you need any of them for your own conservation efforts. Please let me know in the comments below if you have any questions or if you have any other general paper conservation topics you want covered in the future. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And until next time, take care of one another.